Hi, everybody. Good evening. Welcome to Evoke Therapy Program's broadcast. I'm Dr. Brad Reedy. Today is August 10th, 2022. Tonight's topic is what is wilderness and how does it work? Now, as you might imagine, I've given this presentation well over 100 times in my career, having worked in this field for 26 years, co-founding our program back in the late 90s and then running it for the past 24 years. So this is a topic that I'm really familiar with. And so I started to pull together tonight a bunch of old quotes and research evidence and put together a slide deck for my presentation, my talk, my broadcast tonight. I thought, I'm just going to go back to just the main points and discuss it, and I think a much more, accessible way. And I'm just going to share with you my experience having worked in this field for all of these years. Um, Before I do that, I want to, I know that a lot of people turn off the podcast or maybe even log out of the broadcast while I'm doing some of the announcements coming up. But I want to take a moment to remind you of the next Finding You opportunity. Finding You is our intensive therapy program for individuals. It's the flagship program of our therapeutic and intensive program that we host outside of Park City, Utah, in the Heber Valley, just over the mountain. It's an in-depth look, excuse me, at your family of origin, at your background, and trying to make sense of what the dilemmas that you're dealing with today have to do with that old story, have to do with that history. It's an immersive process. I've been to it as a participant for 8 or 9 years, and it's something that I've paid for my family, my adult children, colleagues, friends, partners to go to. So I can't endorse this enough. If you want a springboard for your own work, if you don't know where to start, or you're looking for a therapy accelerator, Finding You is a wonderful process. In fact, we're just starting a Finding You this evening. The new participants are going through their first evening of welcome and orientation this evening. So I wanted to start off with that. When I talk about wilderness therapy, really what I'm talking about is a delivery method. I want to be as clear as I can. In wilderness therapy or within wilderness therapy, we use cognitive behavioral therapy, dialectical behavioral therapy, emotionally focused therapy, action and commitment therapy. Um, every Virtually every therapy, EMDR, brain spotting, every therapy that you can imagine is presented in wilderness therapy based on what the therapist is trained in, what their experience is, and also what works with the client. I love the quote by Carl Jung who said, master all the techniques, but just be one person sitting across from another. And that moment of sitting across from another person in the high desert of southern Utah is really the magic. All of that stuff that we do that's evidence-based is on top of sitting out in the dirt, sitting out in the mountains, sitting out in the desert, and having one human soul connect to another human soul. So the first thing you should know is that I think probably the biggest misunderstanding about wilderness therapy, because the method is so counter culture. It's not very common, although I will say the more and more we are inundated in our lives with technology and screens, I think more people are becoming aware that the new luxury is being disconnected from screens and technology, and that the reboot that happens when we spend time in wilderness regulates the nervous system. I think more people are becoming aware of that as our wilderness areas, both figuratively and literally, are shrinking. But the biggest misunderstanding about wilderness therapy, in my experience, is people don't understand it's a really sophisticated, intelligent, educated, evidence-based therapeutic approach. The difference between us and a residential treatment center or a mental hospital is that we're doing it outdoors. And I'm going to talk about what that outdoors portion of the programming does for people. But you should imagine the difference between a state psychiatric facility and wilderness therapy isn't the level of sophistication of the diagnostics and the therapy that's being implemented. It's that you're doing it in the natural environment. In fact, around the turn of the century, from the 19th century to the 20th century, in the early 1900s, there was an epidemic, the flu epidemic, the last pandemic that happened around 100 years ago. that was starting to build. And what they did is they took patients out of psychiatric hospitals, asylums is what they called them, and they put them out in tents in San Francisco and also on the East Coast. And they noticed immediately that the mood of the patients was elevated. So while you think about camping therapy or outdoor therapy as some kind of a grand departure from science and from what we know, it's really just going back into nature and using that setting, that background, that delivery method to implement the kind of therapy that we do. So that's the first thing that I think is important to understand. I love this quote, one of my favorite quotes of all time from Andy Goldsworthy. He said, "We often forget that we are nature. Nature is something separate from us. So when we say that we have lost our connection to nature, we have lost our connection to ourselves." I'm going to read a quote to you that I read the other night at my first broadcast back from my vacation, where I was talking about James Hollis's middle passage, the second half of life, and the work of James Hollis. And at the outset of the broadcast, I share this passage from the Nine Rusty Armor, which is one of the books that we ask all of our clients to read during the course of our program. It's a really easy, quick read. The average adult probably can read it in 45 minutes to an hour, I suppose. And it's an allegory of a knight who gets so stuck inside of his armor, his defenses, that he needs the help of the magician Merlin to get it off. It's funny on this slide, I spell the name Merlin like the name of the street that I live on is spelled, but actually in the book it's Merlin. That's neither here nor there. This is the first encounter that the knight has looking for the magician to help him get this armor that has become stuck to him, that he can't separate from. And here's how it reads. It reads, "Warily the knight climbed down from his horse. I've been lost looking for you," he said to the magician. "I've been lost for months." "All your life," corrected Merlin, biting off a piece of carrot and sharing it with the nearest rabbit. The knight stiffened. "I didn't come all this way to be insulted. Perhaps you have always taken the truth to be an insult," said Merlin, sharing the carrot with some of the other animals. And then it goes on. I'm not presenting this for the same reason that I presented the other night. It came to me when I was doing a staff training this week and I was reading this passage to them. Something subtle in the background of this slide. When Merlin says, confronts the knight and says, "You've been lost all of your life," the author chose to add into it that he bit off a piece of carrot and he shared it with the nearest rabbit. And then later on, when he doubled down on his loving confrontation to the knight, he shared the carrot with some of the other animals that were nearby. Now, is the author just trying to paint some kind of magical moment, like in the wilderness with this magician? And I don't think it's just that. What the author is showing us with the symbolism of the knight sharing his carrot with the nearest rabbit is that the magician sharing his carrot with the nearest rabbit. What he's trying to show us is that the magician is one with nature. The rabbit is symbolic of our of nature and what we expect a rabbit to do. We don't expect a rabbit to approach a human, and we don't expect a wild rabbit to receive a carrot from one of us if we were sitting next to it. But this imagery, forgive my love for metaphor and symbolism and myth, but this imagery is to illustrate that as we do this work, as we become mentally healthy, just like Andy Goldsworthy mentioned in the quote that I just read to you, we become one with nature. In Taoism, the Tao is most often translated as the way. In fact, in a recent Star Wars series on Disney Plus, there was a phrase, "This is the way." The Jedis had a way about them. The monks have a way about them. Buddhists will talk about it being the right way. They'll talk about the right way to walk out of a room, even. What they're describing is this resonance that we have with nature, and how we can learn to be in line with the universe, with the world, with life, instead of at odds with it. And so although it's a small point, what happens in nature is we sit and observe the way that nature works, and we start to understand the way that life works. So there's something that invites an extra kind of mindfulness and doing the traditional psychotherapies that I mentioned before outside in a small group. And I'll talk more about that as we go. Obviously, one of the most impactful and obvious aspects of wilderness therapy is what I call the digital detox, being removed from screens and phones. When if you come to one of our intensives, you'll be asked and you'll be told ahead of time that you're going to surrender your devices and your phone, and we're going to keep them unless there's an emergency. We're going to keep them separate so you're not tempted to use them. And of course, for most of us, it's pretty hard to hand down our addiction, to give up our addiction, our devices. And a lot of people will talk about the discomfort of that. Many will talk about being excited about that. But after a couple of days, you get into this rhythm. You're present. At the end of the therapeutic intensive, just before you leave, we give you back your phones, your devices. And I will tell you that a lot of people are disappointed. But what happens invariably is that everybody goes away from each other. The minute, it's not at the end when we do the closing ceremony when everybody drives away toward the airport. That's not the end of the therapeutic intensive. The end of the therapeutic intensive is when we give you back our phone. When we give you back, your phone. So being removed from devices and electronics starts to reset our minds. That's an important part. Gives us more focus. We become mindful and present. And so much of mental health is about mindfulness. The reason the therapist asks you how you feel, the reason that's a therapy cliche, is they're asking you to be mindful. And when we turn inward, when we can learn maybe with some practice to quiet our mind, our quote unquote overthinking, we can begin to become aware of the unconscious drives. We get out of our or beyond or beneath our conscious mind. So this digital detox, it's the same way of, for me, if I set a bowl of M&Ms in front of me, if I'm watching TV, I can guarantee you that I'm going to eat that bowl of M&Ms mindlessly without thinking. And really that's what our self-medicating behaviors do for us. That's what our devices do for us. I love the comic Louis C.K. when he talks about that most people are uncomfortable even sitting at a traffic light without checking their phone and texting a friend or checking social media. I was sharing with a client recently, it hit me, and I want to say it was around 2016, the first time I noticed it, and now it's ubiquitous. In 2016, I remember watching a television show that I was choosing to watch and checking my phone during the slow portions of the commercials. That's how accustomed we've become from distracting, from finding ways to not be present in our own lives, in our life. So the digital detox is where it starts. Outside of or in addition to that, removing artificial lighting, there's some discomforts, of course, that come from wilderness. You get more sleep, you eat better. The programming in wilderness therapy provides for both of those things. So along with the removal of all your devices and all the distractions, you're also doing things. If everybody in the world who suffered from depression and anxiety got better sleep, ate a better diet, and reduced their screen time, and they experienced no other therapies, we would see dramatic improvements. Just like I said with the tent therapy. In fact, if you Google tent therapy in San Francisco, I think it was 908. I know the pandemic came along a few years after that, but it was early 1900s. If you Google that, you'll read what I already told you, which is just moving people outdoors improve their moods. So we don't separate out hygiene, diet, exercise, exposure to nature and the sun, and sleep from good mental health and good mental health practices. One of the difficult things about mood disorders, right? One of the difficult things about experiencing great deals of discomfort and pain is the things that we want to do don't necessarily serve to improve our mental health. And the things that we know intellectually, academically, on the top parts of our brain, the things that we know will improve our mental health, we don't have the energy or the impulse or the drive to do them. So wilderness therapy creates that for the client. The context matters, and then you insert into that context the kinds of therapies that I'm talking about and the group experience, and what you get is a really, really powerful, in fact, in my experience, the most provocative and powerful intervention that I've ever seen. I wanted to pull a book out. It was sitting on my shelf. I was arranging some books today, and I noticed that I had this book from my sophomore and junior year of college for a course that I took. And in fact, I had this thing that I wanted to get straight A's in college. I ended up getting a B plus in my last semester. I'd given up on it. And the professor gave us an out that if we didn't want to turn in our final project, he would give us the grade he would move us down a third of a grade, but we could still get it. And I ended up with a B plus. But before that happened, I took a course. It had a strange name. It was called Spirituality and Work Inside of the Home. And I thought, sounds like something a religious institution that I went to would provide for people. And I took it not knowing what it was about, but it was really about housework and the work, the chores, the labor that we have to do in domestic housework. And I remember and quoted this in The Journey of the Heroic Parent. One of the things quoted from taken out of the Harvard Journal from 60 years ago was this woman saying, you know, before, when my children were younger, we used to separate peas from the pods together. It was a family activity. Now, she said, and this was in the 60s, I believe, now that we can get them frozen or canned, I must find something to replace what was being transmitted during those times, because when we were picking peas together, something more important was happening than just getting peas. Something was being communicated, something was being transmitted. In this course that I took, like I said, I took it twice because I got a B plus the first time, and at that point I was still committed to getting straight A's. It's a strange thing to do, I know. But I took it a second time, not knowing that it was going to be the theoretical foundation of my entire career. It was just only by coincidence, and I didn't realize it until much later. But one of the things that we did on back-to-back class days was we watched 2 documentaries. One was on the Mother of the Year in Utah. It was a documentary on the day in her life. And one was on this primitive tribe from Africa and a day in their life. And the mother, we watched that one first, and she was organized. She was incredibly energetic. She had exercise time with her children. Her children had an organized and structured nap time. And when they went to sleep, she would clean up the house. I remember, and this became one of the highlighted points of the idea behind watching these documentaries. The children were playing in the rumpus room. They were playing all around and jumping all around. And it took her a few moments to get their attention and get them organized so that they could have structured exercise time. And of course, we looked at the irony of stopping kids in their natural play state so that we can have more organized calisthenics. At any rate, we watched it and we were somewhat impressed by her and also depressed by her day. And we didn't talk much about it after watching that first documentary. Class ended. We came back for the next class, and the professor put on a video of a day in the life of a primitive tribe. We saw something very different. In this particular tribe, the women and the younger children, all of the younger children, any gender, stayed with the mother. The mother carried them around. She fished. She worked near the village to do things that needed tending to for the home, for the huts that they lived in. And the men and the older boys went out and hunted and gathered. And as they hunted and gathered, the older men would tell the boys about the legends that they believed in as their tribe, the gods that they worshiped. The mothers would tell stories, similar stories to the young children as she fished and took care of the things at home. At night, they would tell stories and sing songs that had a religious mythological nature to them. But what happened was there was a seamlessness between what they believed in and the struggle to survive. Everything wasn't separated. You know, it's like you have a parent that's an accountant. They go to work and they come home, and money comes out of the ATM machine or out of the credit card. For this more primitive family, everything was integrated. There was no separation between religion and practicality. So that's the background. Abraham Maslow is a sociologist who proposed a theory that most people, and especially Americans, identify with to a large extent. He said that unless your basic physical and health needs are taken care of, you can't focus on any higher level needs. And the higher level needs involve belonging to a group. And then the highest level need he defined as self-actualization, ego integrity, differentiation, individuation. And he talked about it as this pyramid, this foundation of safety and physical and health needs, and then what it means to belong, and then what it means to be who you are. But what we learned in this class and what these two documentaries that we watched back to back illustrated was that it's in the context of our struggles that we learn what it means to be a part of a group, and we learn who we are and what we're made of. It's not that we would inflict upon our children distress and suffering just to teach them a lesson, but life is inherently challenging and painful. And like I've shared recently, Sigmund Freud and Carl Jung both, and using slightly different language, explain that work and the struggle is a part of survival, and that therapy, the goal in therapy is to change neurotic suffering from everyday suffering. So what we learned in this class is that, yes, years ago it took an entire family to make ice cream. You know, one person would be turning the crank and taking their turn at it. Somebody else would be mixing the ingredients. Somebody else would be making sure there was plenty of ice around the bucket that contained the ingredients. Somebody else would be spreading the salt. And it was a family activity, and it took hours to make. And if you were like me, if you ever tried to make ice cream, we always used an electronic maker. Nobody had to turn the wheel, but you just can't wait to get it. And it's creamy and it's delicious. But more important than the production of ice cream is the interdependence of the family. But now, this came from that course. Now we buy ice cream in half-gallon containers to save time. And typically, the thing that we save time from or for is that we watch TV, or now we get on the computer. It used to take more than one person to clean a rug. Somebody would have to pull it out of the house and drape it over a line, and somebody else would beat it. And so we've lost, because of our technology, we've lost some of the things inherent to the threads that bind us together and that give our lives meaning. And while it would be hard for any of us to turn back the clock, that's essentially what wilderness, primitive living, nomadic wilderness does. The version of wilderness that we do is we take people and we take away their creature comforts. We go camping, not in cabins, right? Not glamping, but we do primitive living camping. And everything takes work, and you can't take anything for granted. You know, keeping yourself clean, keeping yourself dry and warm in the winter, and the attention and energy that it takes the staff to supervise young people who struggle with all of that stuff, that becomes a part, that becomes the glue that binds you together. When a therapist goes out to the field, they'll bring fresh fruit out to their group, or vegetables. If I brought an apple to a client in a therapy office, a 16-year-old, your typical 16-year-old, they would look at me like I was insane. When I bring an apple out to a wellness therapy group, they're like, "You're the greatest in the world." It changes your perspective. I had somebody out years ago who used to work at the State Department, and as one of their assignments is they were assigned to Asia, and they visited some very, very poor primitive cultures in China specifically. And this woman told me this experience reminds her a lot of those people. When she met and sat down with those people, they were as joyful as anybody. Whereas the people that they were meet with in the city weren't necessarily happier at all. In fact, at times were struggling with more mental health issues. So that going back in time, so to speak, getting in touch with our nature, connecting to the big nature is what wellness therapy does. And you don't have to teach a farmer the law of the harvest. What you reap is what you sow. The farmer just knows it. But our children today, I know for myself, I've worked my tail off professionally, academically to build a successful career. I grew up rather poor, and there's a lot of stress that comes with that. So I worked really hard so that I wouldn't have to live in those conditions and didn't have to raise my children. I will tell you, in some ways, I don't think it's easier to pass on the values to my children. Some of my work ethic came out of that suffering of not having enough. When I went to college, my goal to get a 4.0 or get straight A's was driven by this desire. Like, I don't have a choice. I have to work this hard. I have to be that successful. It could be argued that you can run into troubles that way too, and I have, and I'm sure everybody who has had that kind of a background can relate to it. But it's hard when you have disposable income. My mother didn't pay for my college, not because she was trying to teach me a lesson about individuation and grit. She didn't pay for my college because she couldn't. And I had to work at times. In fact, one semester, I remember I took a semester off of my job. Maybe a financial federal loan came in. I don't know why I took a semester off, but I took a semester off working. And I thought, I'm going to take some time and play a little bit more golf with my friends and take a couple of courses. And it was the summertime, and I'm going to relax. And that was one of my hardest semesters ever. I had to scratch and claw to get a decent grade. Yet, contrast that with the time when I was working 2 and 3 jobs, and I had a full course load, and I found a way within that rhythm to do it. So, part of our instinct to prevent suffering as parents, you know this, every parent knows this. Part of our instinct to prevent suffering sometimes gets really, it clouds us with our children. And wellness therapy, again, you can't, it's hard to take a shower out there. It's not as easy to brush your teeth. There's no running water. Doing the dishes at night is harder, and everybody has to work together. But this struggle, quote unquote, is the teacher. And then you infuse into that structure traditional psychotherapies, like I mentioned, and you have yourself something quite magical. Wellness therapy is evidence-based. I'm not going to spend time this evening. I decided not to pull up some slides and show some graphs. You can go to our page on our wellness therapy page where we talk about proven results and the research that we participated in. But again, I want to remind you, wellness therapy is a delivery method where traditional evidence-based therapies are practiced. At Evoke, our foundational theoretical orientation is attachment-based therapy, and there is exhaustive research in that area. So we are an evidence-based program. Insurance companies are slow on the uptake to reimburse for wellness, but that's nothing new. Insurance companies are slow, take every opportunity not to reimburse. It's hard for them to make a profit. if they reimburse everything that's justifiably reimbursable. If I could hang my hat on one thing lately, it would be this. I have on the slide, for those of you that are watching live, I have the logo and the screenshot of a podcast, TED Talk, by a gentleman by the name of Adam Grant. Adam Grant is an organizational psychologist. The name of his podcast is Work Life with Adam Grant. This specific episode, How to Trust People You Don't Like, is the one that I'm referring to and going to talk about today. And what Adam Grant does in this podcast is he interviews and talks to astronauts, and he uses one particular team to highlight the absolute trust that they have to have in each other from their different areas of expertise to live and survive the mission. And what he shows and cites in research that's done by Harvard University is that when they have astronaut teams that haven't worked together before, they will send them out to wilderness therapy, the same kind of wilderness therapy that we do. Not adventure-based wilderness therapy, not recreational wilderness therapy, but primitive living, nomadic. They'll give them enough supplies, some map, and some ways to navigate, and an endpoint, and they have to work together. And in the context of that challenge, that microcosm of life, they learn problem solving, communication skills, conflict resolution, frustration, anger management, all the tools. The difference is it's not contrived. It's not doing. I love high ropes, high ropes courses. If any of you know what those are, they're these things that they built to do exercises and trust falls and all kinds of things with, and they're really exhilarating and fun. And they sometimes will produce a little moment or a little principle that it's akin to an aha moment. I love them. They're fun. They're great. But wilderness therapy is more in your bones. Primitive living wilderness therapy is deeper. I love this quote from Will Wright, who was writing a summary of the history of wilderness therapy. And one of the quotes that he used and borrowed from one of the founders of the original wilderness therapy program, and all of them in the beginning were nomadic primitive living. He said, whenever we adopt what we have come to call contrived experiences, the overall impact diminished for the participants. So exercises and games, they say this Adam Grant says it in this podcast. Exercises, games, team building, things that are supposed to build teams, don't work as effectively as this kind of raw, unfiltered, uncontrived, non-contrived experience of having to work together as a team. So the therapy that happens out in wilderness, while we support and infuse traditional therapies, like I said, it's the stuff in between the therapy that makes it really gold. Someone once said that music isn't the notes, it's the space in between the notes. And in so many ways, wilderness therapy is the same. It's not the sessions. They kind of anchor the week, but that's not the power of it. I remember when I was a brand new wilderness therapist many, many years ago, and I took my first vacation 6 months into the job or so, took a week off. I remember feeling anxious about letting go, and I was in love with my students, as I'd come to learn that I would fall in love with my students over and over again, and I had a hard time giving up my kids for a week. And I came back, and I remember I walked up to Joe, who was the senior staffer that week. Joe and I are still in contact. And I said, so how did it go? And he said, it's the best week they've ever had. And I remember feeling very worthless in that moment, that what I had to add wasn't the magic glue. I remember I had a therapist who had worked in wilderness therapy, went on to work in a residential treatment center, and then was coming back. When he came back to work for us, he brought a couple of clients with him because they weren't quite ready to graduate from their residential school. And at the same time, seemed kind of silly to transfer them over to another therapist. So he brought a couple of them with him, with permission from the program that he was leaving as he came to work for us. And he told us this story after he had been back a week or two. He said, I was meeting with a student of mine who in residential treatment uh, seemed to be constantly engaged in a power struggle with me, a power struggle that was based on the student's apathy to do anything and my eagerness to want to get and facilitate some kind of change in him. He said, but I was out there this week, and after I saw our session traveling down its usual predictable course, after engaging that for a handful of minutes, I just got up and said to the student, I'm done. And I started to walk away. And my student, he said, yelled after me, he said, please don't leave. I'll talk to you. And he realized at that moment something that I realized over and over again, that wilderness is the therapy. You can't hang out there indefinitely. You know, it does the work. It's hard. It's uncomfortable. It's uncomfortable in winter. It's uncomfortable in summer. It's uncomfortable in spring and fall. And each season has its scourge, is what I like to say. Each season has its challenge. Each season puts its pressure on the child. When I went out to wilderness therapy, now let me explain this to you. I went out to wilderness therapy as a father, not a therapist, when my son was in wilderness therapy. And this is well over 10 years of me being a wilderness therapy and being a clinical director and then owning and running my own wilderness therapy program. And I remember going out there and I remember thinking, it was raining, it was crazy. And I remember thinking, the rain is getting in the way. It's making it difficult to have a therapy session. There's lightning, so we need to practice lightning drills, and everything was getting in the way. But I could feel at the same time in my body this frustration and difficulty with being present with what is, radically accepting what is, letting go. And I harken back to a moment years before this where I was in a session. It was October in the wilderness. I was doing sessions in the rain and I was freezing. Both the student and I were snuggled up in our own sleeping bags because we couldn't get a fire if it was out if it was outside of the tent that we had made. The rain would put it out because it was raining. It wasn't cold enough to snow, which would have been better. And then when we had the fire in or inside the shelter we had built, it became too smoky. So it was a lose situation. And after my first or second session, I walked over to Stephen, the senior staff that was running the group. And I said, Stephen, I'm going to give you 5 minutes to talk me out of having the rest of the sessions in my car, which is a huge wilderness therapy faux pas. And I love this. Stephen didn't need 5 minutes. He had one sentence. And he said to me, I think it's important if you show the kids how to suffer. And once he said that, I couldn't go to my car. I went back, slipped inside my sleeping bag, called the next student over, and did the rest of my sessions. Life is hard. It's painful. It's difficult. It has so many variables that we can't control, just like wilderness therapy. And you can talk about, I've said this before, you can talk about letting go or turning your life over to a higher power. You can talk about surrender like they do in the 12 steps. I've sat with kids who have been educated and immersed in 12-step language and culture and slogans. And they've quoted to me letting go and surrendering. And I've said to them, watching their participation in our program, I said, I hear you saying it, but I don't see the surrender. Just like the examples I just gave you of doing therapy in that cold October tent or sitting in the rain with my own son while I was a father. I remember I was training a therapist about setting boundaries with clients and ending the session on time. And one of the things I said to this therapist, I said, by ending the session on time, you're modeling for the client that there's never enough time, right? We don't have enough time to be great at everything. Because the minute I spend at work to excel in that project is 1 minute less with my wife and with my children. And the minute I spend the extra minute with my wife and my child, my job suffers. And everybody knows how we get pulled and torn apart in this process. And so wilderness therapy is like life, only more. It's spending time by yourself without all the distractions available, without all the self-medicators available that take us out of our own lives. And I was going to say requires, but maybe the best word is provocatively challenges us to confront and sit with ourselves, our feelings, our sadness. At times when I've tried to eat healthier, gone on a diet. I don't know if any of you have ever had that experience or done that. I'm a little bit more impatient. When I quit smoking when I was a young person, the first week was I was on edge. Try to go off sugar, try to go off caffeine. It's just like wilderness. You're removing the things that provide that out. When we all just went through the pandemic and the stay-at-home time, the quarantine that we all had, we took away trips to the post office, which before the pandemic I didn't think was a big deal, but after being locked in my house, I found any excuse I could to run an errand safely. Even today, outside of the strict circumstances of those early months and that year of the pandemic, my wife will say to me while I'm working, do you need something to get out for? Because Liv needs a ride somewhere, or I need to pick up something at the pharmacy. And more often than not, I jump at the chance because anything becomes a distraction. And they're not necessarily unhealthy. Going to the pharmacy is not an unhealthy thing. Taking my daughter to an activity is not an unhealthy thing. But wellness therapy creates a deeper, richer, more profound focus on ourselves. Something I learned from play therapy. The reason that for young people we do play therapy, and by the way, I've told this story before, but I was trained as a play therapist when I was in college, and I was the worst play therapist I think they probably had ever seen, and probably to this day they've ever seen. Because I was all up here, I was all in my head, and my professor kept saying to me, "Just play, hold boundaries, keep the child and you safe, but hold boundaries. Excuse me, hold boundaries, but just play. The issues will work themselves out in the play." I went to play therapy with my own children years later, and it's the same lesson. And the reason that we use play therapy with children is because play is the language of children. I know I do this, and I know that a lot of the parents I work with do the same. I try to talk to children like they're people. I'm not talking about young children. I try to talk to 14, 15, 16, 17-year-olds sometimes like they're adults, and they're not. They literally don't have the same equipment I do. And I'm talking, of course, about brain development and prefrontal cortex. So, experiential active therapy is the therapy. Years ago, we had a group that was 10 to 12-year-olds. We don't have that anymore. And I remember going out there and I remember thinking after just a couple of hours, like, my group therapy sessions that I thought were clever and inspiring aren't going to work out here. I've just got to work on the kids on camping every day. And it's in the context of that experiential. It's like when I heard Derek Jeter, a commercial about Derek Jeter. For those of you who don't know, he's a Hall of Fame baseball player for the New York Yankees, one of the greatest of all time. And he had this commercial. I can never find it. Wish I could find it, where he's talking about how his father taught him to play baseball and all the values of teamwork and sacrifice and consistent practice and discipline. And at the end of the commercial, of course, he said, "I realize now that my dad wasn't teaching me about baseball. He was teaching me about life." That's how children learn, through the experience. But because we are thinking beings and we're so obsessed with our thinking, we try to think our children, we try to talk them into mental health. But the experience of working in small groups, this microcosm that is wilderness therapy, just like the astronauts that the Harvard psychologist studied, is a more effective way at teaching skills, relationship, and a sense of self. I've alluded to this idea about play therapy. Wilderness therapy, the backdrop, the method is experiential. What we know about experiential therapy is that it accesses trauma, because good experiential therapy, like wilderness therapy, uses the entire body. You're not just orally or using written language, verbal language, to process. And a lot of our trauma wasn't verbal. It was pre-verbal or pre-conscious or unconscious or experience. Our, our trauma is experiential, much of it. And even if it was words that were said by people, even if it was that, our brains, as we are younger, doesn't have the capacity to recall it or to sort it out. So the experiential nature of accessing trauma and the experiential nature of repairing and healing trauma, that's why I say to people, the experience of sitting with a therapist and telling them something about yourself, that's the healing, not just the lessons they teach or the skills or the tools they give you. That helps. We do all of that too. But the experience of being with other people and sorting it out, again, it's a more effective way. I think it was Benjamin Franklin that said, tell me and I forget, show me and I remember, and allow me to do it and I learn, something like that. Involve me and I learn. That's experiential therapy is more provocative, more, it's deeper, it's more effective. A really important part about wilderness therapy, I cannot overstate this. Our field guides live out with the clients for 8 days. 8 days. They don't leave. They take breaks at times and read or meditate, take turns taking breaks during the day, but they're with your children. They're with the children out there for 8 days. You don't get that in any other version of therapy that I know of. People in psychiatric hospitals don't live there for 8 days. People in therapeutic boarding schools or residential treatment centers, or definitely outpatient programs, don't live with the client for 8 days. So the relationships have to be sorted out. You can't just wait through a shift or ignore somebody because maybe you can make your way through the day without interacting with that person. You have to deal with it. And in my experience, the mentoring aspect, the research has shown that parents attribute a lot of the change to wilderness to the therapist because that's who their primary contact person is. But clients, graduated clients, alumni clients, will state over and over that the number one most impactful thing was the relationship they had with the staff. I think today, even outside of wilderness therapy, I think mentoring and coaching programs for young people where they go surfing together or play golf together. Even my wife worked at a center for eating disorders years ago. They found it more provocative and helpful to go shopping at the mall and to deal with all of the pressures and the body image stuff that comes up in that than sitting in an office and talking about it. I am the first to admit and confess that I get seduced by a really good therapy client, somebody who's really inclined toward insight and creative thought processes. That's my seduction. And that's all the more reason why I love wilderness therapy, because you watch it. I've had clients who can have a good therapy session, but the rest of the week is somewhere closer to a disaster or a struggle. So wilderness therapy is kind of a show me thing. Kind of let's do it. And so when a parent gets those letters from parents, which by the way is another aspect of wilderness therapy that I think improves it over other treatment models, is that you're writing the primary, although we do allow for phone calls and visits, but the primary mode of communication is letter writing. It requires you to be more thoughtful and reflective. You're not going back and forth. You have to wait days to respond and days to receive a response. And I think that separation it facilitates and fosters individuation, which is a primary goal in psychotherapy. Individuation, becoming who you are, becoming more of yourself, less reactive, less dependent. I've said this before, but there's a mindfulness component with wilderness. I love my home office. I love our intensive home. It's a beautiful home, but there's something different sitting in the mountain, sitting on a mountaintop, sitting in the desert. There's something about it that is quieter. Not just I'm not talking about sound, but about the space, the energy. Wilderness therapy, not wilderness therapy, wilderness more effectively facilitates and encourages mindfulness than all the distractions that are present in our everyday life. Grit. One of the things that the research shows over and over again is that clients develop a greater sense of self-efficacy, that I can do it, and that what I do makes the difference in my life. In contrast to what happens to me makes the difference in my life. We learn that the idea of grit is we learn to be willing to fail, be willing to struggle. This comes from some of the research of growth. Google growth mindset and study that a little bit. I've talked about that on other podcasts, other broadcasts. But growth mindset says I can learn, where in contrast, the fixed mindset says either you have it or you don't. Either you're gifted or you're not. And wilderness therapy and the growth mindset says what's more important is me not giving up, me struggling through it. People that get told that they're gifted tend to cheat and avoid challenge more. In research, when we study children in school, children who are taught how the brain actually develops, that one can become a mathematician, one can become a professional athlete if they have some natural talent and work at it. The kids that get taught that do better on tests than the kids that are told that they're gifted, and they're willing to work through failure and struggle more. And wilderness therapy inherently teaches that. I've seen parents more proud of their child working on making a bow drill fire for an hour without success in terms of outcomes. I've seen parents beam with more pride and admiration for their children for that than I have for parents who have seen their child get a fire within 20 seconds. Part of this environment encourages and it teaches working through failing, struggling, and really focuses on effort, which the child is in control of. This is taken from the book Nurture Shock. They contrast work versus recreation. In a lot of ways, we've replaced in our society the virtue of work with recreation. Thomas Edison said, opportunity is missed by most people because it is dressed in overalls and looks like work. Recreation works because everybody's happy. Parents feel less stress and guilt and discomfort. Parents protecting against future failure and struggle. And parents don't like children to be angry with them. But that's not necessarily developing the characteristics that you all want. This is a quote from the research on grit and the growth mindset. Speaking of one child, Thomas didn't want to try things he wouldn't be successful at, his father explained. Some things came very quickly to him, but when they didn't, he gave up almost immediately, concluding, I'm not good at this. With no more than a glance, Thomas was dividing the world into two things. Things he was naturally good at and things he wasn't. Wilderness therapy makes dramatic improvements in that area. Wilderness therapy gets the intention. It helps you manage a crisis. It's individualized. It can provide an assessment of your child, not just testing, but we can observe them in their quote unquote in natural circumstances in relationship to other children. It's not just the therapy session. It gives you a time as a family. I think one of the shifts that happens for in wilderness therapy is that it's a shift for you guys too. The distance creates the opportunity for a dramatic shift in parents. It's preparing students for the next setting, moving from resignation to being here, to acceptance, to even investment. It takes some of the sharp edges off demonstrative behaviors because you can't fight Mother Nature. You learn that you can't, there's nothing you can do about a rainstorm when you're in the wilderness except for build your shelter and build it good. Take care of your gear. Ask for help from the staff when you need it. Participate in group cultures so the load is lighter for everybody. Of course, socialization skills, qualifying you for different settings afterwards. Natural and objective testing is all accomplished in wilderness therapy. And the use of metaphor and symbols is inherent in wilderness therapy. Making the bow drill fire becomes a metaphor. The peers are a huge piece of this process. There's so much that happens outside of what you would consider the traditional therapies. It's camping therapy, essentially. You wake up, breakfast, clean up breakfast, hike during the middle of the day, stop for lunch, journal, classwork, get to camp, set it up. Groups happen spontaneously throughout the day when people are struggling. Maybe they're not working together to cook and eat or clean up, or somebody got a letter from home that's difficult and they don't want to hike. And that becomes a group. Everything becomes grist for the mill. Everything becomes therapy, particularly, specifically, especially the space in between. Like I said, a primary goal of therapy, psychotherapy, is individuation. When I talked about James Hollis last week, he talks about that over and over and over again. Taking responsibility for our lives. I will listen to anybody talk about how their parents hurt them. Absolutely. That's an important, critical, essential part of psychotherapy. And my response gently implies, what are you going to do about it now? Yes, your parents dented you, or your peers dented you, or having a learning difference was a deficit that you had to overcome. All of those things are true. Anything that happened to you, I have compassion for. And now those dents and bruises are yours. And wellness therapy inherently teaches that. And like I said, it's a shift. It's so radically different from what we're accustomed to that I think it creates a shift and an opening for the entire family. I tell the staff, just keep it simple. Follow the standard operating procedures. Keep everybody safe. And don't think about fixing them. Just be present with them. The lessons will teach themselves. Don't sell them or lecture them into mental health. Let it happen to them. Develop grit yourself. Show them how to suffer, like Stephen said to me. We learn to see failure and challenge and negative feelings as okay and part of the process. It fosters the growth mindset, and it reminds us metaphorically. I'm a huge, as you know, fan of myth and metaphor and symbols. It's a beautiful, beautiful illustration of the heroic journey, the journey to find ourselves, the journey that every character and every story that matters demonstrates and illustrates. We learn a healthy detachment. We learn to individuate so that we can be closer. The first ingredient in intimacy and connection is a healthy self. And the therapy is in real time. Again, you're not talking in an office. You're talking in the context that it happens in. So that's all for this evening. I'm happy to take any questions that are left over during our Q&A, but let me get to the announcements. And I'll just say this. The first thing I learned about wilderness therapy, or in wilderness therapy, the very first thing I learned was that these staff are amazing folks. The second thing I learned, that these kids are more resilient than they or their parents thought they were. Having grown up in Southern California, even though that we didn't have a lot of money, I was comfortable. I wore flip-flops and shorts and t-shirt to school much of the year. I didn't even own a winter jacket because I needed it so infrequently that the next time I needed it, I would have grown out of the previous one. And so being out there it's hard. It's uncomfortable. It's challenging. It asks something different of us. James Hollis uses this phrase, and I love it. He says, we all have difficult appointments to keep with life. And wilderness therapy requires us to keep that, or else we struggle and suffer more because of our own doing. And what better lesson than that in life, right? All right, folks, The Journey of the Heroic Parent, which talks about some of the things I've talked about tonight and talks about my experiences with wilderness therapy, is available on Amazon and Audible. The Audacity to Be You is also available on Amazon or Audible. I read the Audacity to Be You. I read a review of it today. I read a 1-star review of the Audacity to Be You. And the person that left it, I don't blame them. They said they couldn't relate because they didn't have any children. But remember, we are children also. When I talk about parents and children, I'm talking about us at the same time. Like I said earlier in the beginning, our next in-person Finding You intensive is September 7th through 11th. We also have an online offering August 26th to 28th. If you want to find out more, contact intensives at evoketherapy.com. If you've attended an intensive, I am hosting and running Returning to You in October 12th through 16th. Anybody who's been to an intensive can come to Returning to You. We have support groups for current and alumni wilderness families. The next available one is August 11th. That's tomorrow night at 6:30 p.m. We also have an alumni-only meeting once a month for wilderness families, August 23rd at 6:30 p.m. Mountain Time. And we have an intensives support group once a month. September 13th is the next offering there. Contact Malia at evoketherapy.com for more information. We have coaching, family coaching, couples coaching, individual coaching, parent coaching, attachment-based coaches trained in attachment theory. If you would like to learn more about it, contact coaching at evoketherapy.com. We have pursuits trips. Think of adventure trips that are customized anywhere from 3 to 30 days all over the world, all over the country, custom designed for you. Think sober fun or therapy light. You can hear my dog in the background. We ask all current parents to go to 6 12-step support groups. Any combination of Al-Anon, CODA, Families Anonymous, Adult Children, or refugerecovery.org. You can also go to the National Alliance on Mental Illness, NAMI.org, for free classes and support in your local chapter. All these podcasts, or all of these broadcasts, I should say, are available on any podcast app, virtually everyone. Just go to your podcast app or Spotify and search Finding You and Evoke Therapy podcast. You can also find us on soundcloud.com or on Evoke's YouTube channel. You can find Evoke Therapy programs and Brad Reedy on Twitter and Instagram using the handles at Evoke Therapy and at Dr. Brad Reedy, respectively. Also, you can find Evoke Intensives on Instagram using the handle at Evoke Therapy Intensives. You can find us on Facebook by searching either at Evoke Therapy or at Evoke Therapy Intensives. And then we have a new blog that is wonderfully curated each week with new content. If you want to give back to people that can't afford treatment and therapy, our charitable partners include choosementalhealth.org, Sky's the Limit Fund.org, and EvokeFamilyFoundation.org. My next broadcast will be next week, August 16th. It'll be a live Q&A. You can come, any leftover questions, any questions that come up in between. If you have family and friends that want to attend, you're welcome to share the link with them, and they are welcome to attend live. So looking forward to that. All right, folks. Thanks for joining me this evening. On behalf of the people that love you and that you love, thank you for showing up and being willing to do your work. Have a great evening, and I'll talk to you next time. Bye-bye.